Good morning, everybody. You are listening to Rejuvenation with Eve Harrow on the Land of Israel Network. It is Sunday, April 22nd, 2018, a strangely rainy day in Jerusalem, the seventh day of ER 5778. And I'm delighted and honored to have on the line with me Colonel Richard Kemp, former British Army commander. So thank you, Colonel Kemp, for joining me this morning.
It's my pleasure. Very nice to be with you.
And I understand that you are in Israel. I understand that because my son met you last week. So you were here then.
I was in the Yeshiva Gush Etzion, and now I'm in Tel Aviv.
That's wonderful. So what brings you to Israel?
Well, I have had various meetings and briefings over here, and I've also been observing the violence on the Gaza border over the last weeks.
Can you give us your opinion?
I can give you my opinion of Israel, which is it's a fantastic country that I come to as frequently as I possibly can. And my opinion on the violence on the Gaza border is that this is just, despite the fact that Hamas have painted this as so-called peaceful demonstrations, what it is, it's another tactic that they're using in their overall strategy to not to defeat Israel, because they know they can't do that, but to vilify Israel and isolate Israel and have Israel condemned in the world community by creating violent situations in which Israel can be portrayed as illegally killing innocent women, children and men, which of course is not the case. But Israel has no option really other than to respond in the way that it does to attempts to break into its border.
We woke up this morning to the news that yesterday one of the, what they call the engineer, the Mehandes of Hamas, was killed in Kuala Lumpur. What are your feelings about that? Do you see a connection with what's going on in Gaza?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. I'm always quite pleased when I hear that terrorists meet their end, because, of course, it's yet another terrorist who is unable to kill innocent people. And Hamas, of course, are their whole goal really is to kill innocent people and have their own people killed. Quite an incredible situation, really, where people who portray themselves as a government and as an army to defend their people, actually, it's the first time in history, really, that they have actually wanted their own people to be killed by their enemies. In other words, by Israel. So yes, I don't know about any connection, but I think it's a good thing when a terrorist is killed.
So for those of my listeners who aren't aware of your record here in the Middle East, can you just give a minute or so on your experience? You're not just here, your experience with terrorists is not just observing what's happening here in Israel, but actually much, much deeper. Could you just fill my audience in a little bit on what you've been doing for the past few years?
Well, I'm a very old man now and retired from the British Army, but I spent 30 years in the Army, and most of that 30 years was spent fighting terrorists, and that includes terrorists in Northern Ireland. I did a large number of operational tours in Northern Ireland fighting Republican terrorists like the IRA, which actually in many ways bears quite a close similarity with the methods and tactics of Hamas and of Hezbollah, and indeed Palestinian terrorists and the IRA did at one time share their expertise between each other. And of course the IRA gained munitions from here in the Middle East. But also I've been involved in fighting Islamic terrorism in intelligence terms when I was the head of international terrorism intelligence in the Prime Minister's office in London, and also in fighting terrorism in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
And was Israel helpful to you during those years?
Extremely helpful in every respect. And, Israel and Britain have got a patchy relationship.
Yes.
Going right the way back to before the creation of the modern day state of Israel in 1917, when Britain announced its Balfour Declaration. In other words, the not only British but international support for a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine, as it was then known. But then, over the years, we did some pretty bad things in relation to Jews in Palestine and then the state of Israel. But on the whole, today we have a very close relationship with Israel. And in my experience, we have gained a great deal of benefit from Israeli intelligence. British lives have been saved in London, in Afghanistan, in Iraq and elsewhere by Israeli intelligence. Israeli battlefield medical technology has saved British soldiers' lives. And Israeli counter-bomb technology and drone technology have also not only saved lives, but made our forces more effective. I've got some personal experiences of dealing with Israeli intelligence services and the IDF. When I was serving in the British Army and working for the Prime Minister in Britain, which really showed me at the time how vital and valuable the link was between Britain and Israel. Of course, we reciprocate as well, but I think Israel is a very, very good friend to Britain, and I hope we continue to be good friends to Israel.
So I was in London at the end of December, and it's disturbing, and it's not a secret either, the rise of anti-Semitism in England. Some of the leaders of major cities, of course, blatantly anti-Israel, very much at odds with what you're saying now and the appreciation that you so clearly have for Israel. So my question is, do you think that there is a thread of anti-Semitism that runs through the British? Two questions, actually, is one. And also, do you think that there is a religious issue here in the sense of the Anglican Church, perhaps, and its relationship to the Jewish state?
I think that there are some very big problems. And one of them, and it's not just Britain, it's also Europe as a whole. But Britain does have a special relationship with Israel, especially good and especially bad.
Right.
But essentially, there is, of course, anti-Semitism running through many of the indigenous populations in Europe, which reared its head, of course, as we all know, most spectacularly and horribly back in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, mainland Europe in particular. Now that I think has died away to a very large extent. It's still there. There are still strains of anti-Semitism among the indigenous population. But one of the reasons Britain was in many ways made some very bad decisions about Palestine and Israel. In other words, when, for example, when Britain severely restricted the number of Jews able to leave Europe, fleeing from anti-Semitism there and come to live in this land, was because of the intense pressure placed upon Britain by Arabs, because they simply didn't want Jews coming back to their homeland. And Britain succumbed to that pressure for a number of reasons, including, of course, economic reasons. And it's been Britain's relationship with the Arabs that has helped shape those occasions when Britain has really had a bad relationship with Israel and with the Jews here. And I think, it's not an exaggeration to say that had Britain not been pressured by the Arabs to not allowing Jews to come here in the 1930s and 1940s, then perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives, possibly even millions of Jewish lives would have been saved that were extinguished in the Holocaust. By no means all of the 6 million or more who were killed in the Holocaust, but certainly a significant proportion might have been saved if they'd been able to come here. So there was that horrendous strain of anti-Semitism. There was the need in British eyes to pander to the Arabs, but that's now been, I think that's been possibly even overtaken by the rise of a very large proportion of Islamic population within the UK, and Muslims generally are brought up, and obviously there are some that it doesn't apply to, but I think it applies to the majority. They're brought up to despise Israel and see Israel as illegitimate, and in many cases they're brought up to hate Jews as well. And it's that which I think is responsible for the majority of anti-Semitism that exists in Britain today. And it's not just the anti-Semitism of the Muslim populations in Britain, but it's the perceived need by British political parties, particularly on the left in Britain, to appease those Muslims and to side with them, and therefore to basically to take against Israel and against Jews. And so that, I think that is the biggest problem we face in Britain today.
Hmm. So there's a policy is being shaped by a fear of intimidation or a fear of terrorism on British soil.
Well, I think it's those two things, but probably even more so by the electoral power of Muslims. Of course, the
Hmm.
left in particular or the Labour Party in particular, attracts Muslim votes in Britain. Now, that again, it doesn't apply to every Muslim, of course,
Right.
because there are many Muslims who are supporters of the Conservative Party. But on the whole, I think Muslims tend to coalesce in Britain around the Labour Party, and it's looking for their electoral influence, in other words, their votes, that has led the Labour Party to its, I think, extremely bad anti-Semitism that exists today, and that is encouraged by the current Labour leader.
Hmm. So, Colonel Kemp, what is it about you that has you see the truth, that has you see the value of a close friendship with Israel, what the Jewish state does for England? Why am I interviewing you? Because you're so different than everybody else.
Well, I would say, first of all, I'm not that different to many other people, and just obviously the majority of people in Britain take their view of Israel from the BBC and from other
Hmm.
news outlets. And many British and European and Western and generally international media have succumbed to what is in fact the world's greatest slur campaign in history
Right.
against Israel. And many media outlets are institutionally anti-Israel. They almost can't help being so. Um, and and of course,
Because because
well,
I mean
it's
everyone has
because
choices to make.
yeah, of course they do, but it's partly because of the effectiveness of this anti-Israel slur campaign, which was started by the Arabs and has been taken up by politicians, international organisations, human rights groups, and media around the world. And
Hmm.
it's partly that. It's partly, and I don't want to go into a massive explanation of this,
Right.
but I don't want to bore your listeners. But I think one of the problems is in Britain and in other European countries is post-colonial guilt. Um, and they pander to other cultures, and it comes back again to this the quite common hatred of Israel and of Jews by many Muslims in Europe, and again it's partly the media pandering to them. But
Hmm.
back to my point, I think most British people are influenced by the media. They've never been to Israel. They know nothing about Israel. They know
Right.
only what they see in the media, and therefore their opinions are biased on the basis of media bias. Now, many people I know in the army, in the armed forces, either serving or retired now, have a different story, because although they probably in most cases don't have direct contact with Israel, what they do have in common with Israel is fighting the same kind of enemy. Because, of course, I mentioned IRA terrorists are similar to
Hmm.
um, Islamic terrorists that Israel faces, but also the most British soldiers in recent years have fought Islamic terrorism in Iraq and in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world.
Right.
And so they have a much greater understanding of what the reality is, of why the IDF operate as they do. And they therefore support and sympathize with Israel and with the IDF. And they themselves use the same tactics as Israel uses against terrorists. They don't see, as the media tries to portray, Israel as being uniquely awful in this circumstance, because Israel is not uniquely awful. Israel is simply using the same tactics as the rest of us use, which we have no choice other than to use against this form of terrorism. So I think what I'm saying is I'm not unique, but I think I'm one of perhaps a few people in Britain who and in Europe who is prepared to stand up and express our views.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons I do that is because I know exactly how much I personally and the UK, my country, owes to the state of Israel and how great a friend Israel is. And in the same way as I would never stand by and watch and listen to British soldiers being vilified and attacked by the international media or human rights groups or international organizations or politicians, I wouldn't do that to Israeli soldiers either. And I feel a need to play my small role in sticking up for them in the media.
Would you say that your personal religious beliefs also play a part in your feelings towards Israel?
Well, I'm a Roman Catholic,
Hmm.
and obviously my morality and my sense of right and wrong is influenced by my religion. but I know there are people, plenty of people I know actually, who would call themselves Christian Zionists, who really support Zionism because their religion persuades them to do so. I don't see myself in that light. I am a Zionist and I am a Christian. I don't see myself as a Christian Zionist. So in general terms, yes, I suppose my religious views have shaped my morality and therefore shaped my understanding and the need to stick up for what is right against what is wrong. But it's not really for me a religious issue.
Mm-hmm. So you've gone on record more than once as saying that the Israeli army is the most moral army that you think has ever been in history. Why is that?
Well, I think that the IDF is an extremely moral army, and I think that they share a morality with, and it's of course based to a large extent on Judeo-Christian values. They share a morality with armies like the British Army and the US Army. I think, if anything, the accusations levelled against the IDF for committing war crimes and crimes against humanity and for callously killing innocent people, I think, if anything, it's the opposite of the truth, because there are two reasons why I think that they are very, very strong in their morality and their attitude to killing. And one is that unlike in the British and the US Army, many other armies, the IDF is not a volunteer army.
Right.
There are, of course, some volunteers in it, but it's mainly a conscript army. And whereas if you join the British Army, you join because you want to fight. That's what you want to do. You're that type of person. You're an aggressive, gung-ho type of individual on the whole, and you want to fight. If you join the IDF, you don't do it because you want to fight. You do it because you've got to defend your country and you have to join the forces because the law requires it. So you end up not with such a large number of aggressive people as you have in the British Army. You end up with a lot of people who don't want to fight. They want to be behind a computer. They want to be building roads. They want to be a doctor. They want to be a lawyer. They want to be a taxi driver. Whatever it might be, they want to be. That's that's their priority, not fighting. So I think you find that there's a different approach to combat in general terms among Israeli soldiers, and that's not a criticism either of the British Army or of the IDF, because they're different and they have their own ways of doing things. But I think it does help explain why I think the accusations against the IDF are particularly wrong. And the second reason is Judaism. And I recognize that the majority of Israelis are not practicing Jews in religious terms. But I do believe from my own experience here that Judaism and the values of Judaism pervade society in Israel to a far greater extent than, for example, Christianity does these days in the UK. And that includes, I think, the IDF. And so what we have is a large number of people fighting the IDF who are not aggressive gung-ho warriors and who are, one way or another, much more influenced by religious values than they are in the UK. So I think that, to an extent, explains that the incredible morality of the IDF.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Torah tells us, the Bible tells us to choose life. And as the mother of soldiers, no one currently in the Army, you met one of my sons, a former soldier. That's how we raise our children, is to appreciate life, to protect life. And one of the big fears, again, as a mother of a soldier, following closely on the heels of something happening to our children, is the idea that they will have to hurt someone else. It's a terrible thought. And but as you said, we have to protect our country, and there's no one who's going to do it for us. So I'm glad that you understand that as not so much of an outsider, I would say, at this point in your life.
Well, I think I always feel that Golda Meir's comment summed up,
Mm-hmm.
it really echoes what you say and sums up the morality of the IDF and the thinking behind the way the IDF operates in terms of how it deals with civilians. And that comment was along the lines of, we can forgive the Arabs for killing our own children. We can never forgive them for forcing us to kill their children.
That's right.
And I think that morality is not recognized by the other side. The other side, in fact, are the ones committing war crimes. The other side, the Palestinian terrorists, are the ones who are deliberately not only targeting innocent women and children in Israel, but they're also doing so from behind human shields, from behind innocent people in their own population who they want to protect them. And they want Israel, if possible, they want Israel to kill so that they can get some kind of publicity value from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Achilles heel, I think, of all of us in the West is that we want to protect our people, and they have a tremendous advantage in being very happy to sacrifice their own people. I'm talking about the Islamic world in order to get where they want to go. I'm not quite sure that the world understands that this is not, mutually assured destruction, that everybody kind of calmed down in the 50s and in the 60s because nobody wanted their own people to die. And the situation that we have here in the Middle East, and not just with the Palestinian Arabs, but with Iran and all of our neighbors, is one of which they are very happy to even kill their own people, as we're seeing in Syria, in order to get wherever it is that they think that they're going. And that, do you think warfare is going to have to change because of that realization?
Well, I think one aspect of Israel's world is changing, which is that the rise of Iran, and we've seen, and largely as a result of, or certainly supported by President Obama's efforts, we've seen Iran develop its imperial aggression around the region to an almost unprecedented level, to the extent that they now have very strong presence and very strong influence in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen, where they've been precipitating a civil war within Yemen, and also targeting Saudi Arabia. So that rise and the danger that Iran presents, including Iran's ambitions to get nuclear weapons, which again have been facilitated by President Obama's foolish nuclear agreement, which I hope President Trump will get rid of soon.
You do? Okay.
I hope he will, and I believe he will. His decision point comes up on, I think, the 12th of May, when he's given a deadline for the Europeans who stick by the deal to reshape the deal, or he, I think, has said he will get rid of it if that can't be done. And I hope he does get rid of it, or at least, if not get rid of it, I hope it's reformed to the extent that it does actually do what it is supposed to do, but fails to do today, which is to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear armed state.
Do you think your country, do you think Britain will be behind him, will support him?
No, I don't. I think Britain is in favour of keeping the deal, as France and Germany are, and other European countries. Now, they, I hope, will come into line in due course. But the point I was making was that because of Iran's aggression and strength, many other regional countries fear Iran, and you have therefore seen unprecedented cooperation between countries such as Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states and Israel. Of course, we've had peace treaties between Israel and Egypt and Jordan for many years now, but we've always had a war situation, maybe not an active war, but a war nevertheless, a war mentality between countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel. But now that they feel threatened by Iran, they're turning to Israel to help them, and they see Israel now as much stronger allies than they do many other countries in the region, because they recognize Israel's experience, ability, and power. And I think that is a very good sign. And we've seen, for example, Saudi Arabia allowing use of airspace for passenger aircraft to come across on the way to Israel, which they've never done before. Just small things like that publicly, but under the radar, there's been massive amount of cooperation. And I think that is, as I say, I think that is a good thing. But at the same time, I don't think that Israel should be lulled into believing that they've now got permanent long-term allies among the Arab countries. I think there's always going to be, maybe, we should look at it as tactical advantage to the Arabs now, which could change in the future.
Mutual interest is quite different than friendship. So Indeed. One last question, because I know that you have to go. You were here last week for the 48 hours that are very indicative of what Israel is like. We have our Memorial Day, and then we immediately roll into our Independence Day, which of course this year was a tremendous celebration because it was 70 years. Any thoughts about being here in Israel and what you experienced last week?
Yes, I have actually been here previously on those incredible days. And I think it struck me last time, and probably even more so this time, because of the significance of the 70th anniversary of the recreation of the State of Israel, that there is such incredible and palpable feeling for Israel's fallen soldiers, and of course for civilians who were killed as a result of terrorist action and police, etc., which it reflects the immediacy of the conflict, I think, that Israel faces, and the way it touches such a large part of Israeli society. And I myself was driving at 8 o'clock on the eve of Memorial Day, and like every other motorist on the road, stopped my car and got out and stood by the car
when the siren
sounded.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you don't see these days in the West. In Britain, after the First World War and immediately after the Second World War, you saw some similar action. You saw everything sort of freeze at the equivalent day and hour in the UK, but you don't today. So I think that's one thing that that we can see is the incredible appreciation of Israeli soldiers on Memorial Day and others who have been killed in either battle or in terrorist action.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's such an important thing that respect is shown for people whose lives have bought continued safety and security of the Israeli state, and also, of course, the continuing prosperity of Israel. And then, people often comment on it. It is quite a phenomenon to see the transition from Memorial Day into the Independence Day, the 70th anniversary of Independence Day, and that again is an incredible thing. The joy and the real festive spirit of so many people in this country who, I think, in a way that you don't see celebrated. Of course, Britain doesn't yet have its Independence Day. We're hoping soon to have Independence Day from the EU when we get out of the EU. But the US, of course, does have its Independence Day, and many other countries have their Independence Day from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So we're quite conscious of that. But I think it's in a way it's more fervent perhaps than in any other country, and that's, I think, is again because Israel recognizes the dangers and the threats to itself, and I think people can see and appreciate the incredible achievements that this country has made in that 70-year period. I think it's actually unparalleled in history that a country has emerged from non-existence, certainly non-existence for 2,000 years, to an extremely successful, vibrant, economically, I think, hugely well-performing country, which has given also not only has done so much for itself, an incredible amount for itself in such dreadful circumstances as being surrounded by enemies that want to kill you, but it's also done so much for the world. And again, the people who want to see the end of Israel, the sort of BDS campaigners, boycott, divestment and sanctions campaigners around the world, they themselves are using benefits of Israeli ingenuity and technology in their campaigns against Israel. For example, they're using computers and phones, most of which have components that originated in Israel. They're using medicines that originated in Israel. So even Israel's enemies, which are fighting against it, are still using Israel's ingenuity to survive themselves. So I think it's been quite an experience to be here over this period of time. And I have to say, although, everyone always adds the caveat that Israel is not a perfect country. Well, what country in the world is a perfect country? But Israel is absolutely magnificent country. And I think, certainly it's one of the greatest countries in the world today.
Colonel Richard Kemp, my eyes are full. I wish that there were millions of people like you. And if you ever want to be Prime Minister of England, I will do whatever I can to convince my friends there. I don't think I'll have to convince anybody. Thank you so much for your true friendship. I think anybody listening realizes that you just speak from the heart and from the head and from experience. And as an Israeli and as a mother, I want to thank you so much for everything that you do in order to straighten out the impressions of Israel in the world, and really for your constant devotion to this country. I think that we're a living miracle, and it's wonderful when I see that other people do so as well. So thank you so much, and for joining us here on the Land of Israel Network today.
Thank you. It's been an enormous pleasure, and I hope we can do it again one day.
I certainly hope so. Okay, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. I want to thank Ben and Tabitha and everyone else at the network. Once again, you're listening to Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation, broadcasting from the one and only Jerusalem. You can write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. Always happy to hear from you. Take care, everybody. Shavua Tov. Goodbye for now.
Josh Haston here, host of Israel Uncensored on the Land of Israel Radio Network at thelandofisrael.com. Make sure you check out my show every Monday, bringing you the news unfiltered and uncensored, information that you are not getting anywhere else, especially not in the mainstream media.
Israel Uncensored with Josh Haston on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com.